Okay. Is he counting, or I can start now?
Do you see yourself?
Yes, I do. All right, so great. So welcome to the CERIAS Security Seminar Series. Today it's my great, it's my great pleasure to introduce myself. I am Dongyan Chu from the Computer Science Department. I am an assistant professor, and my research areas include computer malware defense investigations, virtualization technologies, and the application of virtualization technologies to system security problems and to virtual distributed computing problems on the internet and in the cyber infrastructure. So today I'm going to talk to you about some of the work that we've been doing in the recent month. Namely the OS level taint analysis for malware investigation and defense. So this work is in collaboration with a lot of people. Some of them are recent graduates from Purdue, actually from CERIAS. First of all, Professor Shushan Zhang at George Mason University, and Professor Florian Buschholz at James Madison University, and Aaron Walters. So these are the guys who work with me and when they were graduate students at CERIAS. And also Dr. Yiming Wang from Microsoft Research, and of course Professor Spaff at Purdue. So this work is motivated by the problems with internet malware. So internet malware remains a top threat to our cyber infrastructure, to the internet, and to our computers. So malware is kind of a generic term because it kind of characterizes and it means a number of bad software, things that perform malicious things on your computer system. So this include computer viruses, computer worms, and spyware, for example, things that got secretly installed on your machine and do bad things, or steal your personal information, or steal your identity. And also, like in the recent past, we have seen the emergence of bots or botnet, meaning that the malicious software agents kind of organize themselves into a powerful network doing bad things in a collaborative way. And if you look at this report, this is actually a report released by Symantec. You will see the number of incidents of malware or viruses or worms in the past few years. So you will actually see an increase from the late 90s to the early 2000s. The number of incidents of malware on the network, and these are actually malware that have been detected and captured. So you'll see like the increase in the number of incidents, and also you will find some of the famous incidents or some of the famous warns that you must have heard about in the news media. So so that's not the main gist of this picture. So the main goal of this picture is to show you the mysterious decline of malware incidents starting in year 2004. So if you look at this figure, you realize that where are the bars for year 2004? You don't see that, right? Because there is kind of a strange decline of malware or internet worms or viruses discovered by investigators. So is this a good news? We definitely hope so, but unfortunately that is not the case, because the problem is that these malware or viruses or worms are getting stealthy, meaning that they try not to do massive propagation in a very short period of time, because that can immediately catch the attention of malware investigators, and they can, like the investigator can, in turn come up with defense mechanisms, right? So in order to avoid being detected, these viruses try to do stealthy things and try to kind of hide themselves. So they try not to do massive, fast propagation. Instead, they just kind of, in a very stealthy way, get into your system and lurk in the system for a sustained period of time. And during their residence in your system, they do all kinds of bad things, in the background, in a very secret way. And they try not to be detected, and they try to be hiding from the existing intrusion detection system or the anti-virus software. Okay, so And again, we have kind of so this is kind of like a characterization of the new features or the trends taken by the malware authors. So they increasingly use, for example, new exploitations or new vulnerabilities. So as soon as a software vulnerability is released, a new virus or new malware can be relatively fast developed. So they use some of the exploitations or the specific vulnerabilities that does not come with the corresponding patch. So this makes the system extremely vulnerable if your system is infected by such so-called zero-day exploits or zero-day attacks, because these are brand new and these are without any cure, any patch, right? And the second strategy we have been noticing is that the warrants or the viruses are taking the slow and low approach, meaning that they just do their propagation in a very slow way. Like in the past few years, some of the warrants are able to infect all the vulnerable machines on the internet within seconds or minutes or hours. So now they realize that this may not be a good strategy for them, because that will kind of lead to relatively fast response from the defense side. So what they do is to do the low and slow infection, right? And so basically, it can easily kind of get around to the intrusion detection system or the trapping internet trap system, so that they will do the propagation without being noticed. And some of the new attack strategies include, exploiting some of the vulnerabilities on client-side software. So the first generation computer warrants usually exploits vulnerabilities in a server-side software. For example, like your web server, your DNS server, or your DCOM or remote procedure call. So now they are targeting your the software that you use on your desktop, like your web browser, your email reader, your instant messenger, things like that. So this becomes a kind of a emerging trend in the malware development. And also they kind of they're adopting also some of the non-traditional media or vehicle of in propagating the copy of the malware. For example, we have actually seen viruses that are spread using the RFID tags. And also using cell phones and things like that. So this kind of creates a kind of an additional level of complexity and challenge on the defense side. So and more recently, we have also found the trend of organized crime by these malware incidents. For example, I'm sure you have heard of the term botnet, namely a group of bots kind of collaboratively do bad things, including DDoSing a website, right? DDoSing CNN.com, or sending spam emails. So in fact, a non-trivial percentage of spams that are sent out to people on the internet are sent by these bots. So they are actually coordinated, and they are under the control of a bot master, and the bot master kind of just secretly infect your machine and take control of your machine, within days, weeks, or months. And then they will actually use all the bots that they control to do all kinds of things. So these are what they call the value-added services. To us, these are the value-added harm. So we need to kind of really get very serious about that. And also now even a market is emerging. So actually these bot masters actually sell the identities of the bots to third-party evildoers, right? Because they actually sell these bots, for to spammers, to people who want to send out spam emails about stocks or other things, and they can make a profit. So this is now they actually have economy incentive to do these things. So this is what we call the botnets for sale. So all these are the trends and problems with the current malware. So this is the state-of-the-art kind of a malware propagation and contamination on the system. So for malware investigators, namely us, so what are some of the tasks that we have to engage? So the first thing is to identify the signs of malware infection, right? Because this is always the first thing that you do. For example, how do you detect that your system is infected by a malware? So namely, what's the detection point? So sometimes you realize that, for example, you realize a suspicious process or you realize that a new file, kind of a strange file created on your computer, or sometimes you notice that, a file get corrupted or deleted and all kinds of things. So these are the sign of malware infection and contamination. So the task for the malware investigator is to catch these signs, as soon as possible. And as you will see, this is not always easy. And once you identify the infection or the intrusion of a malware, the following tasks are the following. First of all, you need to kind of investigate through which software or through which vulnerability, right, did this malware infect your system. So there must be a door, there must be a kind of a leak in your system that kind of attract or that kind of led to the successful intrusion into your system. So the first task is to identify the break-in point. The break-in point is usually a vulnerable software, a software that communicates with the outside world. For example, on the server side, a vulnerable software can be a web server or a DNS server or other server software. And on the client side, this vulnerable software can be your web browser, your email reader, or your instant messenger software, right? And then once you identify the breaking point, that kind of only completes the first step of the malware investigation. The second step is to enumerate or to identify all the damages that the malware has done to your system during its residence. So this is also important because you want to understand what kind of harm the malware does to your system, and in some cases you may want to recover from the damages done by the malware. So these are the two things: identifying the breaking point. Number two, identifying all the contaminations. Okay, so like in the defense against the malware, right, or in accomplishing the two tasks that I just mentioned, the researchers and practitioners have developed a number of powerful tools based on logs, right? So I want to show you briefly how does some of the current log-based malware intrusion investigation tool respond to a malware incident. So let's take the internet worm, for example. Let's say this is a worm that targets the vulnerability of a specific version of a web server, right? So once compromising your web server, right, this worm, right, in this case, so that's the incidence of the malware, will create, for example, additional processes, right? For example, the most typical one being, like opening a shell. So this shell process can further spawn multiple processes. Some of the processes, like this netcat, will actually scan or look into your files. So this kind of can potentially lead to the unauthorized disclosure of file content of your machine. And also, it can modify or it can corrupt local files, right? I mean, by this shell process. And it can further spawn processes that will further download additional malware into your system. For example, this is how the malicious attacker install like backdoor or rootkit in your system, right? So these are the bad things done by this malware after entering your system. So it enters through the breaking point of the vulnerable HTTPD daemon, right? That's its breaking point. And after breaking into your system, it performs a number of things, right, in the steps. So the current log-based approach, the current log-based tool for malware defense, they actually record the steps or the system calls made by the malware or by the relevant processes, and they are able to reconstruct the bad things done by the malware once once the malware existence or once the presence of the malware is detected. So this relies on a thing we call the detection point. So here, if you see the alert, right? For example, I noticed that a rootkit has been installed in my machine. So that is what we call an external detection point. So from this detection point, we want to answer the question: what is the original breaking point, right? What's the vulnerability? What's the specific vulnerability of my system that ultimately led to the installation of this specific rootkit? So that's the first question. The second question we want to answer once you have that external detection point is the identification of all the damages, right? Because in addition to the rootkit installation, this malware does other bad things, including, for example, reading your files, creating additional processes or downloading additional malicious software, things like that. So you are supposed to identify all these actions, right? So these are the things that the malware investigation is supposed to uncover. So let's take a look at how these two steps are done by the current log-based investigation tool. So it starts from the collection of log. So by logging the system calls made by the malware or made by the malicious processes created by the malware, so you can actually see a whole bunch of actions, in the form of system calls, right, during the residence of this malware. For example, including the creation of new processes, the reading of files, the downloading of, the opening of a new socket, downloading additional malicious software, things like that. So every system call is logged, right? And these log entries are stored in a log file for, for future forensic investigation. So everything I just talked about, namely the collection of log, happens during the runtime of the system. Right? And then at some point, so this some point could be like days or weeks or even months later, after the initial intrusion of the malware. So at that point, maybe as a user, I realized that I found this, kind of a weird file or this, malicious process running in my system. So that is considered the external detection point, because that one, that sign is noticed by me, the user, right? And once I notice this, anomaly, I will report this to my system administrator, right? And then the administrator will kind of retrieve. So this, now everything, I talk about next happens offline. So once this incident or this detection point is reported to the system administrator, the system administrator will use the log entries, right, that have been collected to perform the investigation. So the first step of the investigation is to retrieve all the previous log entries, right, from in the past week, month, or even year, right? And then it would start a reconstruction process. So this reconstruction process starts from the detection point, right? It will start from the corresponding log entry that logs the action of installing this rootkit, and we will go all the way back to the original breaking point of this malware incident. So once you identify, for example, that specific software that communicates with the outside world, namely, in this case, the HTTP daemon, we can tell that the initial breaking point of this malware incident is a vulnerable web server, right? So by doing that, we kind of backtracking the actions performed by this malware based on the log entries that have been collected in the past. So you now so notice that this backtracking process uses the entire log file as its input, right? It just grabbed the relevant log entries and put them in the right place and reconstruct the story, right? So now we complete the first step of a malware investigation procedure, and there is a second step. Namely, I need to identify all the other damages, because as you realize, these are not the only damages done by the malware, because it does something more, right? And then with this breaking point identified, we are able to again use the log entries collected, and we will kind of pull out the relevant log entries and construct, the entire graph. And this graph kind of identifies or reveals all the steps, all the bad things done by the malware. So that kind of completes the process of malware investigation using the log that has been collected, right? So this is the state of the art. This is the typical workflow of doing malware investigation or forensics. So we identify a number of problems with these with these tools. So the first problem is that, as you realize, in order to go from your detection point all the way to the breaking point, to the initial breaking point, you have to use the entire log file, right, as input. You need to pull out, you need to scan all the log entries, and you need to construct the graph. And you can imagine that the construction of the graph is pretty computation intensive, because it involves the scanning and the examination of all the log entry in the log file. So basically, it needs to analyze the entire log, right, in order to identify the breaking point. So once you identify the breaking point, you also need the entire log to identify all the contaminations. So basically, both these two steps require the entire log as the input. for this forensic investigation process. The problem is that you can imagine that like thousands and millions of log entries are generated every day, right? In fact, based on a recent experiment, gigabytes of log data are generated on a daily basis. This is a very typical kind of a web server kind of a workload. And so basically, imagine you use this gigabyte of log file to perform the forensic investigation. You are likely to experience a relatively long forensic investigation procedure, right? So the time taken to identify the breaking point, the time taken to identify the contaminations tend to be long, and we want to reduce, the overhead and the latency of such investigation, because timely investigation is critical. Because once you identify all these things, you can correspondingly come up with the patches, or you can correspondingly, perform some of the recovery operations, and you can, in a very timely fashion notify, other users of this specific vulnerability, right? And so that hopefully their system will be kind of patched or prevented from similar attack. So basically, you'll see that there is a problem with this long detection period. So this is what we call the intrusion occurrence and detection interval, right? And this interval is the interval from the point the malware infects your system to the time instance when I, as the user, get suspicious of my machine or get suspicious of something going on in my computer. So this can be, this interval can be days, weeks, or even months. And you can imagine during these days, weeks, and months, gigabytes, hundreds and tens and hundreds and thousands of gigabytes of log data are generated. So basically, that makes your forensic investigation process longer and longer. So, and another problem is that maybe you have realized that the thing that triggers this investigation, or not nothing, but is the identification of a suspicious activity by the user, namely myself, right? So basically, you have to wait until until an anomaly or a suspicious item is identified, and then we can trigger the investigation. So this may be kind of too late sometimes, because maybe the malware has already done most of the harm and also the bad things, because these are actually so the investigation process is triggered by external detection points. So during the time during that occurrence detection interval, the log file simply sits there passively. The log file itself does not contribute to the triggering of the investigation, right? Because the log file is involved after I identify that detection point. So it will be very desirable for the log file to provide some of the leads or some of the hints or anomaly warnings to trigger a more timely malware investigation. So this capability is not provided in most of the current log-based approach. So to address these problems, or to fix these limitations, we come up with a scheme called process coloring. So process coloring can be readily applied and integrated into the existing log-based investigation tool. So the investigation tool does not have to be modified. They can still use their reconstruction algorithm, parsing the log entries, and construct the step-by-step story of the malware intrusion. The advantage of our approach is that we make the investigation process shorter. And let me show you how. So the main idea is to do some tainting. So I want to do something proactively, right? Before the incident happens, I want to kind of assign different colors to different software systems. Like I will assign a color to my web server, I will assign a different color to my mail server, and I will assign a third color to my DNS server, so on and so forth, right? Now, every one of these software systems is a potential breaking point. We just don't know yet, right? At that time, when we kind of taint these different systems. So what I want to do is that I want those processes created or spawned by these server processes to inherit the color of the original software. Right? If you do that, you can realize that the color the corresponding color of these potentially vulnerable software gets propagated and tainted to all the subsequent processes and objects. So by objects, I mean, like, for example, files, shared memory created by processes, or sockets opened by these processes, right? So everything will be tainted with the same color. So I want the color to record the traces or the footsteps of a sequence of operation. So now, with this coloring or this tainting scheme, you can naturally partition your log entries into multiple subsets, and each subset bears a different color. So I will show you now next, why such partition is powerful and useful in improving the efficiency of malware investigation. So I use the same example, but now I have integrated my process coloring scheme, right? I want to show you how I can improve the efficiency of malware investigation. So before I start the system, I need to do some extra work. I need to proactively taint or dye my server applications with different colors. So now you see you have the gold, you have the yellow, you have the blue, you have the red, right? So these are the different colors assigned to different software. So now let's focus on the HTTPD. That's the web server, right? So this, let's say, imagine that this warn targets the vulnerability of this HTTP daemon, right? And it will first compromise this vulnerable software, and then once the malware enters your system, it will create additional processes, and these processes will open file, read file, create new processes, and doing all kinds of things. Now the key difference is the following: every step it takes, the colors, the red color follows the action of the malware. So that's the key difference. If you look at the traditional way malware investigation is done, such tainting does not exist. Now I have this tainting process, that occurs at runtime, following the actions of the malware. So maybe at this time I'm still not aware of this, the bad things going on in my computer. But at some point, if I realize that, for example, a rootkit has been installed, right? Let's say, again, let me show you the same scenario. Now, let's say I, as the user, notice that a rootkit has been installed. What do I do? Or what additional advantage I have? You can immediately check the color of the file, right? And then you can immediately tell that this is due to the vulnerable HTTP daemon. You can do that even without performing a log-based analysis because of my proactive tainting work. Right? Because now the rootkit file bears the red color. And we know that the red color must have been inherited somehow, transitively, from originally the HTTP daemon. That's one big advantage. The second benefit, now you realize that the log entries are partitioned into multiple subsets. Every subset has its own color. So in order to reconstruct the whole story, in order to reconstruct the whole episode, I no longer have to use the entire log as the input to my forensic investigation tool. I only use the subset that bears the red color. That's it, right? And you can use the same algorithm. You can use the same reconstruction algorithm as the algorithm used in the traditional tool. So that part we don't modify. That's why I'm saying that this technique can be readily integrated with the existing forensic analysis tools. So let me just show you a kind of a excerpt of the log that we captured in a virtual environment. So this is actually the log entries that correspond to a slapper worm intrusion. So you see log entries of different colors. Every entry records a system call, right? It's that simple. The only thing, the beautiful thing is that now they are naturally partitioned by their colors, right? So once you identify this this suspicious log entry, namely, you are not supposed to have suddenly have a shellcode, launch in your web server. So that's highly that's highly suspicious. So once you have that, you can immediately tell by the color of the corresponding log entry, and you know that this shellcode must have been introduced or caused initially by the HTTP. Yeah.
Did you add the on the log file? Did you add just the color, or was the HTTP already added, or was that already present in the log file, or did you just add the tag of the HTTP?
I add the tag to HTTP. So I do need to kind of record this additional information, right? For example, in
Before
your
they didn't even have the send mail or the HTTPD, it didn't have any of that.
no, they do. Before you can use the system. So during the system initialization stage, we pre-color or we pre-taint, these different software, like SendMail, HTTPD, DNS, things like that, right? So this is great because you can safely ignore those blue entries without affecting the accuracy of your investigation result. Yeah.
How would it be different than actually maybe taking the process number or maybe the actual name of the process?
That's a great question. In fact, I have an answer to this question in my technical report. So basically, in short, we cannot use the process ID as the partitioning index because the process ID does not get inherited and propagated throughout the process creation and the and other process operations. If you look at, for example, the child process created by a parent process, does the child process inherit the process ID? It does not, right? It is assigned a completely independent process ID. So if you use the process ID, you lose the provenance, you lose the lineage of its origin. Yeah.
So this is a separate fork that you're creating, or how's it actually implemented?
You have to modify the operating system kernel. So for every system call, you need to add this tainting operation. That's why we call it the operating system level tainting. So in fact, this also show you a part of the investigation or the reconstructed episode of SLAPper1 infection, right? And you can see like the ovals are the processes, right, with the process numbers, and also you will see that, for example, now you see like there are two different IDs, right, 2568 and 2587. So if you only use the process ID, to do the partition, you will assume that 2568 and 2587 are not related, right? However, they are in this case because they are tainted with the same red color, and this is only part of the SLAPper1 intrusion steps. So a more complete description of the complete description of a SLAPper1 intrusion is shown in this figure. So it involves multiple things, including the spawning of a shell, and also creation of new files, and also the attack, and also the launching of the next the next round of infection and propagation. So these are the kind of the system level features, right, of process coloring. So process coloring is based on a very solid theoretical, a solid theory. It's based on more specifically information flow theory. So information flow is a well-established theory that captures the interaction and influence between objects and subjects. So this work is actually I consider it as the instantiation of the abstract information flow theory in the context of operating system and also operating system level objects and subjects. So here, each subject, every process is a subject. The subject is active, right? And each, like the file, directories, or sockets, share memory, and these things are considered objects. So these are shared resources manipulated by the subjects, namely processes. So when the process perform an operation on an object, or a process perform an operation on another process, there are information flows that go between these subjects and objects. So the task is to capture them and preserve them in the log. So this is something that was not done in the traditional log-based tools. And also, I would like to point out that process label is the model defined actually in Florian's PhD thesis, and our work is an instantiation of the process labeling framework in the context of malware investigation. We also, looking at the experimental platform, we have also been developing a virtualization-based platform for integrated malware capture, investigation and defense. So for the detection and capture of malware, we have built a architecture called a honey farm. So a honey farm is nothing but a bunch of virtual machines waiting to be attacked by real-world malicious software, right? And then once you capture, for example, a specific incident, you are able to get a live copy of the bad thing, named like the viruses or the worms or other malware, and then you can do some further investigation. And then in the background, you want to redirect, you want to unleash, the malware that you capture. Then you kind of unleash it and you let it run and you observe what kind of bad things it does, right? And usually this is very dangerous and high risk because you don't want any negative impact, to be leaked to the real world. So that's why we have some, advanced techniques based on virtualization technology that achieve the strict confinement of all these negative impacts. So I call this the testing ground. I call these the malware testing ground, right? The testing ground has to be confined, and in the meantime, the testing ground has to have a high fidelity, because now the malwares are getting more and more smart. If they realize that they're running in a testing ground, they will stop doing the bad thing. So you need to kind of you need to come up with some advanced technique, to make them believe that they are running in a real and a malicious system. So once we have these, like the honey farm front end for the capture of malware and the back end to replay the malware, we come up with we come up with a bunch of defense and investigation mechanisms. So these are actually, well, this is just kind of for advertising purpose. So we have done some other work, including the characterization of the behavior of malware. This work was reported in the Warren workshop this year. And also we tracked the contamination done by the malware. This is actually described in this talk today. And also we have some defense mechanism that will randomize the system runtime environment so that the malware can simply cannot perform the bad things in the first place. So I'm going to focus only on the contamination tracking, based on process coloring. And all these are enabled by virtualization. And in a moment, I will show you why virtualization technology is important. So you realize that the key to the log-based investigation tool is the collection of log. Because once you have to, in the first place, you have to have trustworthy logs. If you don't trust your log entry, then it's kind of like garbage in, garbage out, right? You have to make sure that your log entries are trustworthy. However, this is very difficult to achieve if you don't do something extra. So just take a look at the regular way of collecting logs. Usually the logging module, is supported by the operating system, and it is running in the same system as the system that you are monitoring. So this creates a problem because, philosophically, if you want to monitor something, you're not supposed to be part of that something, right? You have to be somewhere outside. However, most of the current monitoring logging mechanism resides within the system that it is monitoring. So that creates a problem. Because once the system gets compromised, you can no longer trust the log collection mechanism, and correspondingly, you cannot trust the log entries. And then all bets are off, right? Garbage in, garbage out. And let me show, what time is it?
It's 7.
So, I have, okay.
About 15 minutes.
All right, so let me just quickly show you this figure shows the current implementation of a system called logging mechanism, how it is implemented in most of the current software system. So I want to just quickly show you how system call is made, right? You have the system call dispatcher in the operating system. Depending on the ID of the system call, it gets dispatched to different code in the operating system kernel, and then once the results are generated, it will get back to the dispatcher and get back to the user space. This is how system call is performed. And in order to record the system call and its corresponding action, this is the standard, quote-unquote, state-of-the-art implementation. You just insert that logging mechanism between the dispatcher and the actual operation, the actual execution of the system call, right? So once you have that, you can, intercept the call, and then the system call will just, the system call path, the execution path will have to go through this logging mechanism because everything has to be logged. The problem is that this can easily be bypassed. And there have been reports that show that it can be, such kind of system call interception mechanism can easily be either bypassed or fooled. And this can be done even without compromising the kernel space. You can, in some cases, well, not all, You can even do that in the user space. So that makes your logs untrustworthy, right? So we take a completely different approach. You recall the figure that I just showed you, the way log entries are collected, and take a look at this one. So instead of doing the logging in the system, I do the system call interception and logging and the storage of logging outside the system I'm monitoring. So how do you achieve that? You have to so now, of course, the thing is that this is enabled by this virtual machine technology. So instead of running your software in a real physical machine, I run it in a virtual machine, right? Virtual machine is a all software-based entity. So basically, you can create multiple virtual machines on top of the same physical machine. So the advantage of virtualization is that it gives you the opportunity to monitor these virtual machines from outside the virtual machine. So you can see that the interception of system call happens on what we call the system virtualization path, right? And the system virtualization path is completely independent of the virtual machine that is being supported, right? Once you intercept the system call, you generate the log entry, and you don't store that log entry in the system that you are monitoring, right? That's a bad choice. Instead, you push the log entry to somewhere else. You push it to somewhere that is more trusted. In this case, it will be stored in the host domain, in that physical host domain. Of course, here we are making the assumption that the virtual machine achieves strict or high confinement. Namely, you cannot influence things that are outside the virtual machine from inside. Everything happens inside the virtual machine will be strictly confined within the virtual machine. So if you accept that assumption, then this will give you a more tamper-resistant logging mechanism. I cannot say 100% tamper-resistant, but it is definitely more tamper-resistant than the previous approach that I showed. Yeah.
You have to have a look or some kind of I/O interface to look into that virtual machine.
That's right. That's right. So that
Wouldn't that be effective for the bad guys to rely?
No, because actually, once you're on the system virtualization path, the bad guys are not aware. So the bad guys are not supposed to be aware of this virtualization. Of course, I think that's a good point because so in that case, you do have to pay extra attention to the implementation of this system virtualization path to make sure that the bad guys inside the virtual machine will have no influence on the system virtualization path, or more specifically, on the implementation or data structure of the system virtualization path. Anyway, so we have done some experiments using real-world warrants. So some of the warrants are the ones we capture using our honey farm. So we just capture them from the real world, and some of them, we actually also synthesize, our own malware because we realized that some of the warrants, some of the real-world warrants are simply not malicious enough. So you want to push the envelope and and also to come up with the most unfavorable condition to test the effectiveness of the malware investigation technique. So among the warrants that we experimented, I want to just show you 3 representative set of experiments. We actually experimented with more than a dozen warrants and their variants. And for the 3 warrants, namely the lion, slapper, and SARS warrants, we are able to identify its initial breaking point before log analysis by just looking at the color of the corresponding log entry. So these 3 warrants exploit different vulnerability in different software. Lion warrant exploits the DNS server vulnerability. The slapper one exploits the web server vulnerability, and the SARS one exploits the Samba server vulnerability. So you need to identify the specific software. Then, for example, the malware investigator will go and fix or patch these respective software systems, right? And another advantage is that you will see that the percentage of log entries that I need to investigate in order to reconstruct the episode is significantly reduced. So the best performing case is the SARS one. So I only have to process 12%, slightly more than 12% of all the log entry. I was able to reconstruct how SARS-1 infect my system, how SARS-1, install backdoors and everything by checking those 12% of the log entries with the specific color, because I can safely discard log entries bearing other colors. So I want to, of course, by now I have shown the main features or the main effect, some of the experiments demonstrating the effectiveness of process coloring or tainting. I want to kind of flip the coin, and also I want to kind of show you the other side of the technique, namely its limitations, right? So the first limitation or the first potential problem with process coloring is that, because everything now so depend on the color, right, or the tainting information. So what happens if the malware gets even smarter? Once it gets into my system, it will try to contact, different software, and so that it will get multiple colors. So when a bad thing happens, you look at the log entry, you realize that that single entry has not one but 2, 3, or 4 colors. Then you can no longer tell which one is the real breaking point, right? So that's bad. But if you think about if you think about this scenario, I was actually encouraged, because that actually gives you a additional level of anomaly detection. The thing is that if you see a log entry with multiple colors, which we call color mixing, if you see a log entry that shows this color mixing phenomena, that one, that color mixing itself is an anomaly that deserves further investigation. Because if you look at the server environment, if you, for example, for the industry infrastructure where they consolidate all the server software in one physical machine, like the web server, mail server, or whatever, I mean, they are supposed to run independently. They are running in the same system simply because of cost cutting or consolidation. So they are not supposed to talk to each other. If you see a log entry with multiple colors, that indicates that this log entry or that corresponding process is influenced by multiple applications. So that is not normal. So that gives you a hint or a lead, right? To look, to explore or to investigate further. So this is what I called a anomaly detection point. And if you recall, I mentioned that one of the problems with the existing tool is that it relies on an external detection point to trigger the malware investigation. Now, if you have this color mixing phenomena, the color mixing, it will give you more timely triggering of malware investigation, because once your system has a log entry with multiple colors, you can immediately raise an alarm saying that this is not normal. We need to go from that specific log entry and we need to trace back and see why that log entry has so many different colors. Right? And semantically, it means that this process has been influenced by multiple server applications. So you may notice that I've been focusing on the server-side environment, because I'm less confident in saying the same thing about a client-side environment. Why is that? Because in the client-side environment, applications do talk to each other, right? Because sometimes you use, for example, a Word editor to edit a file, and then you use the file, you edit your source code using an editor, and then the source code get compiled by GCC or other compiler. So you do see the interaction or influence of multiple applications on your stuff. And these are actually legal. So that's a problem. So in fact, the client-side color mixing does create some additional complexity, in uniquely identify the root cause of your malware intrusion. So the second weakness is that we kind of assume in this approach that the operating system kernel has integrity, because the operating system kernel actually performs the tainting, right? As I said, if the tainting mechanism is not trusted, then all bets are off. So in this work, we kind of assume that the tainting mechanism, which is performed by the operating system itself, is trusted, right? That is, I have to admit that this is an assumption. Right? And in many cases, this assumption simply does not hold, because we also know that there are many incidents of kernel level malware infection and malware attack, like the kernel level rootkit, which is considered one of the most malicious, most stealthy, and the most difficult one to detect and to defend against. Right? So so basically this approach does have the limitation. If, for example, if the kernel level integrity cannot be guaranteed, then all bets are off. All the tainting mechanism, the tainted log entries are not trusted, right? Fortunately, there have been some parallel works that address the integrity of kernel level mechanism, right? And these are work that kind of preserve the integrity and check the integrity of your operating system and raises an alarm if, for example, if your operating system has been compromised. And also, this information flow-based approach is not very good in detecting covert channels. Meaning that, for example, if I use like some like implicit information to infect or to influence process, let's say two processes communicating via let's say the CPU utilization percentage or the on and off of disk activity. If the two malicious processes agree on some of the signals, right? And let's say that if the disk is on, I mean 1, and if the disk is off, I mean 0. If the communication channel between these two malicious processes is via such information, then this approach cannot detect the influence or the information flow, this covert channel-based flow between them. So there have been some related works that are kind of related to this effort. Basically, first of all, the theoretical underpinning is the operating system level information flow model, more specifically process labeling. And also some of the traditional or current log-based investigation tools include backtracker and forward tracking its forward tracking extension. So basically, these are the systems that use the log entries to reconstruct the steps of malware intrusion. We also have information flow theory applied to other levels. So this is just one level because we focus on the operating system level tainting. And there have also been work on in machine instruction level tainting and language level tainting. So they give you also different level. They review the malware behavior and action at different levels. For example, for the instruction level tainting, they are able to, for example, detect the propagation of a untrusted data, right? With the execution of the instruction sequence. And they use that to actually characterize the vulnerability of the attack. And also there are language level tainting mechanisms that will perform the kind of the tainting operation within a program, right? And basically their tainting is at the granularity of variables, objects, data structures, things like that. So they actually these tainting operations happen within the same program. So they will actually zoom in to the specific vulnerable program to find out what is the root cause of this vulnerability, right? So now you realize that these two capabilities, like the tainting operation at these two levels, the operating system level and the language level, kind of complement each other. So for the operating system level tainting, I am able to identify that specific software, right, as the breaking point. But what is the specific nature of the vulnerability? I don't know. Right? So you have to do the language level tainting to uncover, that information. Maybe, for example, it's due to a out of bound statement, or a statement without doing bound checking, things like that, right? So those root causes can only be identified or uncovered by language level tainting with a finer granularity. So in conclusion, I kind of talked about the taint-based operating system level tainting-based mechanism called process coloring for malware intrusion and contamination tracing. And it is based on a virtualization, it is based on a virtual machine-based implementation, giving you higher temper resistance for the log entries to perform malware investigation. And it introduced 3 new capabilities, right? The first one is to use the color to identify the breaking point. The second one is to use the color to partition the log so that when you reconstruct the episode, you only need to use a subset of the entries. The third capability is the one that I mentioned when I talk about the multiple coloring scenario, where you can use the multiple coloring as a trigger for more timely malware investigation. So you don't have to wait until the user realizes something is wrong, right? The log all of a sudden becomes an active entity, an active guard of your system. The log will tell you something is wrong. So that's enabled by process coloring. If I have time, I would just want to kind of quickly show you some of the client-side investigation that we are just starting to do. So the client-side vulnerability is more difficult because, as I mentioned, the client-side applications do communicate a lot. They are kind of different from the relatively independent nature of server-side software systems. So this one, so basically, let me first show you the incident. So what we do is that we kind of we run a vulnerable web browser, right? This web browser, is not patched and exhibits 3 different vulnerabilities. The ones that the 3 vulnerabilities, that I show on the left-hand side of the slide. And if this web browser contacts a malicious website, so that website is set up by some malicious party, right? And they want to compromise your web browser. So once you click this link, you got these 22 applications automatically installed on your desktop without your permission. So I even had to kind of do some sanitization before showing you this because. So then the challenge is the following: how do you identify this is the problem of your web browser, not like your instant messenger or your email reader or your other software, right? Very similar to the server-side investigation. And then the next step is to also to reconstruct the whole episode. How these 22 applications get installed without my permission. So you need to reconstruct the story, you need to reconstruct the steps. And as I mentioned, to do that on the client side, you actually have to deal with more noises. You have to deal with many false positive scenario. You have to distinguish the real bad things and the legal interaction between processes or influence between of the process on individual objects. So I guess I will stop here.
All right, time for one quick question.
Yeah.
If the attack of a malware is not targeted at the kernel, but targets immediately the log file, and basically possibly changes the color codes for any way, shape, or form, how would you detect that? I mean, did you take that into consideration at all?
Yes, I do. So I have 2 points to make. The first one is that the log cannot be tampered with by the malware, because the log is stored outside the system, right? If you look at that virtualization-based log collection mechanism. So the log is not even in the virtual machine. The log is outside the virtual machine. And current virtualization technology enables a strict confinement of the virtual machine, meaning that if you are within the VM, you cannot touch things that are outside of VM. My second point is that the tainting mechanism, the coloring operations themselves, are assumed to be trusted. I do assume that the operating system has the integrity of doing the tainting operation, but that assumption does not always hold, unfortunately. So that's the limitation of this approach.
Thank you.
All right. Yes. Hi.
Your implementation. How did you pass the state